Good evening. For those who don't know me, my name is Mary Catherine. I have the privilege of serving here as the pastor here at Newark United Methodist Church, and I am so excited to have all of us gathered from Head of Christiana Presbyterian, from Calvary Baptist, from Newark United Church of Christ. So Reverend Cynthia Robinson, Reverend Dr. Hillary Livingston, and unfortunately I don't know your last name, Pastor Christine Lewis. So it's just great to have you all here this evening. As we continue with our service this evening, we're going to go into the Gospel of Matthew, the 6th chapter, verses 1 through 6, and verses 16 through 21. I will be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Beware of practicing your piety before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. So whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And whenever you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, so that they may be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And whenever you fast, do not look dismal, like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces so as to show others that they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, put oil on your beard and wash your face, so that your fasting may be seen not by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The Spirit of God has been present in the reading and hearing of these words. Thanks be to God. This evening, I have a story for us. One of the challenges of technically being sort of the newbie on the block is I have no idea what stories anybody's heard before. This evening, I'm going to share a story with you that is entitled The Emperor's Seed. It may be familiar to some. It goes like this. There once was an emperor who had no children and needed to choose an heir, a successor. Thousands of children from across the kingdom came to the palace and were surprised when the emperor exclaimed that he was going to choose one of them. He gave them all a seed. They were to go home to their villages, plant the seed in a pot, and tend it for a year. When they returned in a year, the emperor would judge their efforts and choose his successor. Now, there was a boy named Ling who received his seed and returned to his village. His mother helped him to choose a pot and put some soil into it. Ling watered his pot every day. Once a week, the children of the village would get together to compare their plants. After a few weeks, there were signs of life in all but Ling's pot. The weeks passed, and Ling continued to water his pot every day. After a few months, the pots really came to life. Some had trees starting to grow, some had flowers, and some had leafy shrubs. Poor old Ling still had nothing growing in his pot, leading the other children to make fun of him. Ling continued to water his pot every day. A year passed, and it was time to return to the palace to show what had grown and decide on the new heir. Ling, as you might imagine, was anxious, as his pot still showed no signs of life. What if they punish me? They won't know that I've watered it every day. They'll think that I'm lazy. His mother looked him in the eye and explained that whatever the consequences were, he had to return and show the emperor his barren pot. Ling and the other children entered the palace gates. By now, some of the plants were looking magnificent, and the children were wondering which one the emperor would choose. Ling was embarrassed as other children looked at his lifeless pot and scoffed. The emperor came out and started to make his way through the crowd, looking at the many impressive trees, shrubs, and flowers that were on display. The boys all puffed their chests out and tried to look as regal as possible, hoping that they would be chosen as the heir to the empire. Then the emperor came to Ling. He looked at the pot, then he looked at Ling. "What happened here?" he asked. Ling muttered nervously, "I watered the pot every day, but nothing grew." Then the emperor moved on. After a few hours, the emperor finally finished his assessment, looking at wonderful grown plants. He stood in front of the children and congratulated them on their efforts. "Clearly, some of you desperately want to be emperor and would do anything to make that happen. But there is one boy that I would like to point out, as he has come to me with nothing. Ling, come here, please." "Oh no," thought Ling. He slowly sauntered to the front of the group, holding his barren pot. The emperor held up the pot for all to see, and the other children laughed. Then the emperor continued, "A year ago, I gave you all a seed. I told you to go away, plant the seed, and return with your plant. The seeds that I gave you were all boiled until they were no longer viable and wouldn't grow. But I see before me thousands of plants and only one barren pot. So Ling here will be my heir." If you were asked by someone to describe a perfect Lent, what would it look like? Anyone want to hazard a shout out? It's a trick question. In our society, we live with this myth that we must work to be perfect in everything. The perfect employee, the perfect parent, the perfect person of faith. We are told that if we do not achieve perfection, as the world or some others might define it, then we have somehow failed. Imperfection looks marvelous, like some of those plants. We're shown airbrushed pictures of models in magazines with the message, either direct or indirect, you want to be like them. We're shown only the shiny parts of the lives of professional athletes we might see, or TV hosts and celebrities and movie stars, and encouraged to compare our lives, except on those rare occasions when one of those folks say, "I will not participate in that perfection narrative any longer. When we seek to live and serve that perfection narrative, the only seed that's planted within us is a seed that produces a sense of failure and discontent. I told you earlier, what would that perfect Lent look like was a trick question, because sometimes organized religion, today if you look at some of the things I did, it didn't look so organized. But if you look at organized religion, you can hear a message that a perfect faith and faith life is what is required of us. And it looks a certain way, and only one way. Jesus used the word hypocrite to describe, well, those about whom he talked. Those who treated religious practices as a holy checklist. Yes, it's Lent, and yes, I don't want to scare my colleagues. Yes, we're called to engage in a holy Lent. We're encouraged to find and engage in spiritual disciplines that will nurture us. But there's a danger in such a call. And before we do that invitation to a holy Lent, I want to push back against just a little bit more the idea that what we might think is the right way to live in Lent may not actually be a meaningful practice for us. My hope in doing so is to keep us from falling into that pit of self-righteousness, of being hypocrites, of having a checklist faith. You know, Bible study, check. Went to church on Sunday, check. Added additional prayer time, check. You know, all those things in Lent that you usually hear about, check. We're in danger. And instead of engaging in ways that actually bring us into closer relationship with the divine, we can find ourselves chasing after something perfect that doesn't feed us, that drains us. Something that's as dry as the driest well. Each and every one of us is different. I know I don't have to tell you that, but I'm going to say it anyway because, it makes my point a little bit. Each and every one of us is in different places in our lives. Some of us are still young, in elementary or middle school or high school or college. Or our 20s and 30s, lest those who are in their 20s and 30s think I'm calling them old. Some of us are still in school. Some of us are in our first job. Some of us are starting to look a little bit more toward retirement. Others of us are saying, yeah, retirement. Some of us are in excellent health. Some of us are struggling with our health. And we come to the season of Lent. And I would fail you today if I told you you had to walk a certain path this Lent. That to deviate from what I considered a perfect Lent would then do you harm. Kate Bowler and Jessica Ritchie in Good Enough, 40-ish Devotions for a Life of Imperfection, wrote this: the spiritual life you create is the space where God appears to you with the blessing that is for you. And here's the amazing thing, they continue, the little habits we create with God's guidance will actually be made to fit us. To fit me, to fit you. The particular you in this particular moment. That's meant to be good news this night. No, I'm not going to tell you don't pray or don't engage in Bible study I am going to encourage you to find that thing that fits. For Lent is a season about growing in our relationship with God and with one another and in our faith. One spiritual practice may be extremely efficacious for some of us. And for others, as I mentioned, well, nothing at all. For instance, a big topic at Lent is fasting. And I know for some, engaging in a food fast is exceedingly meaningful. And for others, it could be a special kind of HE-double hockey sticks. Yes, I know you all can spell. Pope Francis asked the question once, do you want to fast this Lent? Well, maybe a type of fast that he mentions will work for you. Fast from hurting words and say kind words. Fast from sadness and be filled with gratitude. Fast from anger and be filled with patience. Fast from pessimism and be filled with hope. Fast from worries and trust in God. Fast from complaints and contemplate simplicity. Fast from pressures and be prayerful. Fast from bitterness and fill your heart with joy. Fast from selfishness and be compassionate to others. Fast from grudges and be reconciled. Fast from words and be silent so you can listen. Maybe there's something that came to mind as I read that list that you particularly feel would nurture you a type of fast, and it's not in that list. No, friends, we don't need to have a perfect Lent, a bright, shiny, look at me kind of Lent. We need to only water the seed that is our life in ways that nourish our unique selves, and leave it up to God to do the growing. May it be so. Amen.